Hello, my friends. My name is Emma, and in today's video, I am going to talk about some of the common mistakes I hear my Brazilian students make. So before we get to that, there are a couple of things I wanted to say. The first thing is I love Brazil. I love Brazilian culture, I love Brazilian food, and I have many Brazilian friends. The reason why I tell you this is because I hear many Brazilian speakers making the same kinds of mistakes. So I wanted to create this video to help my friends out, to help my students out, and to help any Brazilians out who are trying to improve their English. There are many Brazilians in Toronto. It's a great city. If you ever want to learn English abroad, I highly recommend coming to Toronto to learn English. It's an excellent place to study. In the past and currently, I have many Brazilian students. Many people from Brazil come to Toronto to learn English. So this is actually a group of students I have a lot of experience with and experience helping. So what have I noticed about my Brazilian students overall? I have noticed many of my Brazilian students speak excellent English. They're very easy to understand. They have great opinions or interesting opinions on many different topics. So I love having Brazilian students. The conversations are always very exciting when I have Brazilian students. But there's one thing that I've also noticed, and that is that many Brazilian students make the same pronunciation mistakes. So in this video, I'm going to tell you about some of the most common pronunciation mistakes I hear my Brazilian students make and how we can correct those mistakes. So let's get started. Okay, so the first mistake I hear many Brazilian students make is their pronunciation of ED. When I hear Brazilian students pronounce ED for past tense verbs, they often make the sound id. So I will hear Brazilian students say wanted, worked, played. They pronounce ed the same way in each of these cases. But the correct pronunciation is a little strange because in English, ed actually is pronounced in 3 different ways. Sometimes ed is pronounced like id, so that's true. For example, wanted, it sounds like id. Sometimes ed is pronounced like a t sound. So a t sound, a t sound. So for example, worked. So it's not worked, it's worked. And sometimes ed is pronounced as a d sound or a d sound, like in played. So this is one of the common pronunciation mistakes that I hear. So let's talk about ways to improve our pronunciation with this. And we'll also talk about how do you know how to pronounce ed? How do you know if it's pronounced like id, t, or d? So my first tip when it comes to pronouncing ed is that for words that have that t sound, if this is a mistake you're making a lot, I recommend doing what I'm going to show you. I have here work and a T or a T sound. Sometimes using things like our fingers can actually help our brain to remember pronunciation. So what I would do is I would write the verb and then I would write how we pronounce ed. In this case, it's a T sound. And I would actually use my finger to combine these together. So instead of saying worked, I would say worked, worked. And then the faster you go, the easier it actually becomes to pronounce. Worked. Okay, so it's one syllable, one clear line, worked. Now this is very different from a word like wanted. In this case, it has 2 syllables. It has the want and it has the id syllable. So if I pronounce this, I would say wanted, wanted. So you see there's two parts, two syllables to the pronunciation of this. Whereas with worked, it's just one, worked. So now let's look at how we would do a pronunciation with this d sound. So again, here I've written a verb, play, and the ed sound in play is a d sound. So what I can do to stop saying played is I can actually take my finger and just do it in one smooth, continuous pronunciation. Played, played. Okay, so this is different from saying it as play-id. Instead, we're linking it all together into one syllable. Played. Okay, this might take time, especially if you have been pronouncing id for all verbs for a long time. It takes time to change your pronunciation, but I highly recommend practicing this because this will help you, it will help people understand you better, and it will help your accent as well. So now let's look at how do we know when we pronounce ed as id, how do we know when we pronounce it like a t sound, and how do we know when we pronounce it like a d sound. Okay, quick quiz. How many different ways are there to pronounce ed endings? The correct answer is 3. There are 3 different ways to pronounce ed in English. So now I'm going to tell you, how do you know when to pronounce it like id? How do you know when to pronounce ed like t? And how do you know when to pronounce ed like d? Well, let's get started with the easiest example, and that is when ed sounds like id. We pronounce ed like id when a verb ends in t or d. So this might be confusing, but when you see examples, it becomes a little easier to understand. If you look here, I have the verb need. I need something. Now, if I want to talk about the past and use this verb, I add ed. So how do we pronounce ed here? Well, I look at this sound, need. Okay, it has a d sound at the end of need. So this becomes need-id, needed. Okay, so this is probably how you are pronouncing this right now anyways, because like I said, Brazilians often use the id sound for ed. So you don't have to change this. You're probably pronouncing it correctly, needed. Okay, I also said we can pronounce ed like a id when the ending of a verb is a t sound. So if you look here, we have want is the verb. It ends in a t sound. So when we change want to the past, we add ed and we pronounce this as wanted. I wanted to see you yesterday, for example. It's the same with this word, wait. So we have our verb wait. The verb wait ends in a t sound. So when we add ed, it becomes an id sound, waited. And it has that second syllable, waited, wanted, needed. Finally, here's another example with a d, decided. So because decide has this d sound at the end, and again, we're talking about the sound. We're not talking about spelling when we're talking about this. We're talking about the sound. Decide ends in a d sound. So we can add the ed and it makes an id pronunciation, decided. So that's the first rule for pronouncing ed. When there's a t or a d ending, we use the id pronunciation. So what's the second rule? Well, sometimes ed sounds like a t sound. When does this happen? It happens when a verb ends in a voiceless sound. So you might think, oh, what is a voiceless sound? A voiceless sound is a sound that comes from your mouth. If we touch our neck when we pronounce a voiceless sound, there's no vibration here. So you can try this right now. If you pronounce like a p, p, a P sound, this doesn't really move. Whereas if you pronounce a B sound, you will feel vibration in your throat. If this is too confusing, that's okay. You can also just memorize the sounds. That might be a bit easier for some of you. So if a verb ends in a S sound, or the S sound, if it ends in a K sound, or a K sound, a P sound, or the P sound, a Ch sound, or the CH sound, a Sh sound, or the SH sound, a Th sound, or an F sound, or a TH sound, what we can do is we can pronounce ED as a T. So let's look at some examples. I have here the verb shopped. Shop ends in a P sound. So because of that, we pronounce it like a T. Shopped. Shopped. You hear that strong T sound. Shopped. Yesterday, I shopped. Notice I am not saying shopped. I'm saying very quickly, shopped. Now let's look at the next example. Cook is a verb. It ends in a K. So we have here, it's on our list of when to pronounce ED like T. Cooked, the ED becomes a T sound. Cooked. Again, we do not say cooked, we say cooked. Cooked. Okay, now we have the word watched. Watch is a verb. It ends in a CH. So because it ends in a CH, our ED is going to be pronounced like a T sound. Watched. Watched. Yesterday I watched TV. And again, it takes time to get this pronunciation correct. Here's one more example. The verb miss ends in a S or an S sound. So what does ED sound like? It sounds like a T. Why? Because of the sound before. It's an S sound. So if we look here, S means you pronounce ED like a T sound. Missed. You might have to watch this video a couple of times because I know it's very confusing. You're really listening to different sounds and you really got to think, okay, this verb ends in this sound. That means we pronounce ED this way. So I understand it's confusing and it does take a little bit of time and practice. So now let's look at the last way we pronounce ED, which is as a D sound. And when do we do that? Okay, quick quiz question. What is the third way to pronounce ED? We've talked about id, we've talked about t. What is the third? The third is a D sound or a D sound. So ED can be pronounced like D. How do you know when to pronounce ED like a D sound or a D sound? Well, the more complicated explanation has to do with when we voice different sounds at the end of verbs. So what do I mean by voice? Well, if you touch your larynx or this area, when you say these different sounds, you'll feel a vibration. So for example, if you say b, g, z, r, b, m, n, g, e, you actually can feel a movement here. And that's what we mean by voice. But that can get a little complicated. So another way you can remember this is just by memorizing the different voice sounds. There are more voice sounds in English, but these are the main ones. So these are the ones that I'm going to show you today. So whenever a verb ends in one of these voice sounds, we pronounce ED like a D sound. Okay, so let's look at some examples. I have here the verb listen. Listen. If I wanted to turn listen into a past tense verb, I pronounce the ed like a d. Listened, listened. Okay, and notice it's kind of soft. So we do not say listened, we say listened. We have here studied. So studied ends in this E sound. So we actually would pronounce ed like a D sound, studied. Here we have an L. Call ends in the L sound. So when we pronounce call, we pronounce ed like a D. Called. I called you yesterday. It's the same with stayed. Notice we pronounce this with a D sound, and it all depends on what the sound is before ed. Nowadays, we're talking a lot about Zoom. Zoom is a way to chat with people. So if you wanted to say, yesterday I Zoomed my friends, because Zoom, the verb Zoom ends in an M or a M sound, ed is pronounced like a D, zoomed. And finally, buzzed. So buzzed, like right now I am wearing a dress that is covered in bumblebees. What sound do bees make? They buzz. So I can say the bees buzzed. And I can pronounce this like a D sound. Okay, so that's a lot to remember. So you might have to watch this a couple of times. But the main thing I want you to remember is there are 3 different ways to pronounce ed. Sometimes it's pronounced id, sometimes it's pronounced t, and sometimes it's pronounced d. So that is one of the most common mistakes I hear Brazilians make in their pronunciation. Now I'm going to teach you another common pronunciation mistake I hear Brazilians making. Okay, so before we continue, there's one important point I'd like to make. And that is, when I'm talking about ed and the 3 different pronunciations, I'm talking about ed in verbs when we're talking about the past tense. So when we talk about ed at the end of a verb, that's what I'm talking about. I am not talking about words like education, where ed is at the beginning of the word. Okay, so the last segment, I'm specifically talking about ed endings on verbs and how we pronounce them. Okay, so now let's talk about another common mistake I hear Brazilians make, and that is the pronunciation of H and R. Sometimes when I hear Brazilians talk about things and they are using an R word, they pronounce the R like an H in English. So for example, I've heard Brazilians say, when they're trying to say the word red, I've heard them say head. Or when a Brazilian student might be trying to say rabbit, I might hear habit. So Brazilians have their own type of R sound. It's very different from the R in English. So let's just listen to the differences between R and H, and then I'm going to teach you how to do an English R sound. So rabbit has that R sound, rabbit. This is very different from habit, which has a h. It's more of a breathy sound. Rabbit, habit. Or we have here the word red. You hear that? It's almost like a growl that a bear might make. Red. This is very different from head. Okay, so the first way to improve your pronunciation is to actually hear the differences between sounds. So hopefully you can hear the difference between rabbit and habit, red and head. These sound different. So how do we make an English R sound? Well, there are actually different R sounds in English, and there are different ways to make the R. When R is at the beginning of a word, we usually use 2 different ways to pronounce it. So you actually have a choice, and you can choose what's easiest for you. Some people, when they pronounce the R sound in English, this is their tongue. I know this is a scary drawing I am not an artist, so I apologize. Hopefully you will not get nightmares. But this is a person. We have their eye, eyebrow, nose, mouth, teeth, and this is the tongue. So you see what this man's tongue is doing when he's pronouncing R? His tongue's going up. So when he says rabbit, his tongue actually moves up and then down. And notice where the tongue is going up. If you feel behind your teeth, there's actually this bump. Okay, there's actually a bump. The R, when our tongue goes up, it goes close to that bump. It's just right behind that bump. And our tongue does not touch the roof of our mouth. So I don't know if you can see here, but there's no touch. But our tongue goes up towards this bump. And that's how we make a R sound, like in rabbit or red. You'll also notice what my lips are doing. My lips are sort of rounded. So if you look, rabbit, rabbit. But they're not like tight. If I do a tight sound, it actually sounds like wabbit, which is more of a W sound. So I have to be very careful on what my lips are doing. So they're rounded, but they're not tight. Rabbit, rabbit, red. Okay. So that's one way to pronounce R. The second way is where our tongue actually, if you can see, the back of the tongue moves upward. So this is our tongue. This is the front of the tongue. And notice what's happening here. The front part of our tongue stays down, but the back part moves towards the back of our head, actually. So this is called a bunched R. For some people, this way is easier, where their tongue stays down, but it kind of moves back like this. For other people, it's easier if their tongue flaps up. It's your choice. You can practice both and see what works best for you. When you practice R pronunciation, I highly recommend going very slowly. Don't choose words that are very long to pronounce first. Maybe just try the R sound with a vowel. So why not try these are not words, but why not try re, ra, ru. By doing just the R with a vowel, you can actually really focus on that R sound. I also recommend looking in a mirror when you pronounce this and really look at what your tongue is doing. Is it going up? Is it going back? Or is it doing something different? Really pay attention to what your tongue is doing, and that will help you with this pronunciation. So there is one more pronunciation trick I have for my Brazilian students. So let's learn this final trick that I'm going to talk about in this video. Okay, before I talk about the final tip, I wanted to let you know that it is possible to improve your pronunciation. When I was a kid, I could not pronounce R sounds. It took me time to actually learn, when I was about 6 years old, how to pronounce R. So I have been in the same situation as many of you. It can be very scary when you start working on pronunciation because you might think there's so much I need to change. I recommend doing one small change at a time. So maybe the first week, start trying to work on ED. And then once you master ED, then you can start working on your R and H sound. Again, practice makes perfect, but it is possible. I have had many students have great success with their pronunciation. What it takes is practice and paying attention to what your mouth is doing. I think those are the two most important things when it comes to pronunciation. Okay, so what is my final tip for Brazilians when it comes to pronunciation? My final tip is vowels. Many Brazilian students have difficulty with vowels in English. So what do I mean by vowels? Well, I mean sounds like O, E, I, A, U, there are different sounds in English. Usually for vowels, we use different letters. The letters we use to show a vowel is A, E, I, O, and U. So it is tough for people to learn how to pronounce vowels. I'm going to teach you the 2 things you can do right away that will help you with your vowel pronunciation. So let's look at an example first. One common vowel mistake I hear Brazilian students make is they pronounce E the same way as I. These are very different sounds in English. So I'll give you an example. We have here the word sheep, so it has this E sound. And then we have this word ship, which is a short sound. Ship, it is that I sound. Or you might hear maybe a student says eat and it the same way. So how do we improve our pronunciation of vowels? Well, the first thing I recommend is think about how long we say the vowel sound. Is it a long sound or a short sound? So listen to the difference. Sheep, eep. It's a long sound. Sheep. This is very different from ship. Ship is a very short sound. So one way to improve your vowels is pay attention to, is it a long sound or a short vowel sound? That will really help you. The second thing you can start paying attention to is, do you use a big mouth or a small mouth for the pronunciation? So if I say sheep, my mouth really gets big. It spreads. Sheep, E. You see my mouth, it's actually not comfortable because it's like I have 2 strings here, and when I say E, my lips spread and they get very big. This is very different from a I sound. I sound is a small sound. My mouth doesn't really do much. It actually stays quite small. So look at my mouth. E, I. You see, there's one of them is a big mouth sound. The other one is a small mouth sound. So that can help you with your vowels. Let's look at another example. Another common vowel mistake Brazilian students make is with O sounds. So for example, we have here the word book. It has a short O sound, book. We have here the word boot, boot. This one has a long O sound. So even though the spelling is the same, the pronunciation of the O in these is actually different. I have a whole video on this topic, so if you want to learn how to pronounce O's in English, I highly recommend watching this video. But for now, the main thing I want you to realize is to improve your vowel sound, notice when it's a short sound like book, it happens very quick, book, versus boot, boot. It's a longer sound, okay? The second thing to notice is, am I making a big mouth or a little mouth? So in this case, book. My mouth is very small. Boot. Actually, that one is a bit small too, but if I said something like O, you'll notice my mouth gets bigger. So my main point is, when you are learning vowels, think about these 2 things. Is it long or short? And do you have a big mouth or a little mouth in your pronunciation? Again, when you work on pronunciation, always use a mirror and look at what your mouth is doing. That is my #1 tip for you. So thank you guys so much for watching. What you can do now is you can visit our website at www.engvid.com, and there you can actually practice what you learn today, and you can take a quiz on the different types of mistakes Brazilian learners make when they're learning English. So I highly recommend checking out our website and taking that quiz. I would also like to invite you to subscribe to my YouTube channel. There you can find more videos on pronunciation, on vocabulary, on writing, and on many different topics. Just don't forget to ring the bell, because when you ring the bell, you will get notifications of new videos. You can also check out my website at www.teacheremma.com for more free resources. So thank you guys so much for watching, and until next time, take care.